the first 15 minutes will be an independent unit, but it'll be part of this year. So in Parshas Va'era, so God spoke to Moshe saying, Ani Hashem, I am God, Va'era el Avram el Yitzchak el Yaakov bekel shakai, u'shmi Hashem lo nodati lahem. I appeared to Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov with the name Kel Shakai, but my name God, I didn't tell them. The name Yud Kei Vav Kei, the special name of God, I did not make known to them. And this very strange Rashi, one of the strangest Rashis in Chumash, at the same time, one of the shortest Rashis in Chumash. Va'era al Avram Yitzchak v'Yaakov, and I appeared to Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. So Rashi says, El ha'avos, to the patriarchs. Now everybody asks the question, what is Rashi coming to tell me? Is Rashi coming to tell me that Avram and Yitzchak and Yaakov, they were the patriarchs of the Jewish people? We just finished Chol HaMishmos. Who doesn't know that? So what is Rashi saying? Va'era, I appeared to Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, and Rashi says, El Havos, to the patriarchs. Everybody knows that the patriarchs were Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Why does Rashi put in El Havos? So there was a theory advanced, very strange Rashi, there was a theory advanced that really in those days, the manuscripts of Rashi were written by hand, and whoever was writing over the manuscripts apparently was getting tired. And because he was getting tired, he didn't want to write. He liked to write things in short. So he wrote Va'era El, and instead of writing Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, he wrote the words Ha'avos, the patriarchs. In other words, he didn't want to write in the words Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, so therefore he wrote the words El Ha'avos. I'm sorry. So it was just to save himself additional work. So, and this theory is mentioned in the Berliner Rashi. I think the Torah Tamima in one of his books, I don't know if it's in the Torah Tamima itself, also suggests something like that. And now there is an interesting story with Rav Azriel Hildheimer. Now, Rav Azriel Hildheimer was the founder of what later became known as the Hildheimer Seminary. That was a yeshiva in Berlin. It produced many Talmidei Chachamim and also many people who served faithfully as rabbis to the Orthodox community in Germany. And Rav Azriel Hildheimer himself was a great Goen, great posek in Germany. And Rav Azriel Hildheimer, I think he was a Talmud. He was a student of the Ksav Sofer, I think. He was also a student of Rav Yaakov Ettlinger. And anyway, the Rav Azriel Hildheimer, the story, he was once at a resort with a certain Lithuanian Rav, and the certain Lithuanian Rav told him he has a certain question on Rashi. Wasn't this Rashi necessarily? It was a question on a Rashi. And the Lithuanian Rav told him what the question was. Apparently it was a very strong question. And then the Lithuanian Rav went into a whole pilpul, a whole explanation, a very involved explanation to answer his question against Rashi. And afterwards, Rav Azriel Hildheimer said to him, I think if we change one letter in Rashi, will be able to understand that there won't be a problem in Rashi. And he suggested that the printer made a mistake, and with changing one letter, I don't know which letter it was, I don't know which Rashi it was, but with changing that one letter, the problem was resolved. So Rav Israel Hiltzheimer said to the Rav, he says, I want to tell you something. After 120 years, I'm going to go to the Olam Emes. And who is going to greet me in the Olam Emes? The Rabbanim in Europe, they would always talk about when they go to the world to come, the Olam Haneshamos, the world of the souls, who's going to greet them? He said, Rashi is going to come out and greet me in order to thank me for showing what he really meant. Because up till the time that I explained to you that there was a mistake in print, everybody thought there was a problem with Rashi. Rashi will appreciate my efforts on his behalf. He says, but when you go to the Olam Emes after 120 years, who's going to come out to greet you? The printer will come out to greet you because you showed how he was right. In other words, it showed two approaches. Rabbi Israel Hiltzheimer, who apparently, although a great Goen and everything, he had a touch of the modern approach. So he was more adept and perhaps more skilled at the idea of detecting where there might be a mistake in print of the words, whether it's the Rashi or whatever it is. However, but the Rabbanim in other areas, they were not so liberal in their approach, and unless they had really compelling evidence, well, they both wanted compelling evidence, but they were more strict in what they considered compelling evidence. They would not change what was accepted to be the words of Rashi. Now, the truth is, Rabbi Israel Hiltzheimer was a very, very great person. In fact, it's brought down that when Rabbi Israel Hiltzheimer came, I read this in a book, I did not hear it from my father. When Rabbi Israel Hiltzheimer came to visit to see the Beis Halevi, my great-great-grandfather in Brisk, so the Beis Halevi went out to greet him holding a candle to give him special distinction. They say that there were only two people that the Beis Halevi did that for. One was Rav Israel Hiltzheimer, and the other was the Malbim. And Rav Israel Hiltzheimer really had a different perspective regarding just about everything than the Beis Halevi had. Rav Israel Hiltzheimer in Germany, many of his students were people who were educated, had secular degrees. They were great both, and some of them great in learning and great in the field of their studies at the university. And Beis Halevi, on the contrary, he was from the group in Russia that fought against Volozhin allowing any secular studies, and even under the pressure of the government, even when the government closed the yeshiva because they wouldn't have the secular studies the way they wanted. So, but nevertheless, the Beis Halevi, when he went to greet Rav Israel Hiltzheimer, he went out with candles to give him special distinction. Apparently, I mean, it's something that I thought about. It seemed very strange to me. The Malbim also was somewhat a more open perspective than most of the Rabbanim of his time, but not to the degree of Israel Hilzheimer. But apparently the Beis Halevi felt that different situations in different places and perhaps different times demand different approaches. Of course, one has to be faithful to the Masorah, whichever approach one takes. And perhaps that's the reason he understood what Rav Azriel Hilzheimer was dealing with in Germany, and he wanted to give recognition to Rav Azriel Hilzheimer for, in a sense, leading the battle in his time against those that were trying to negate the Masorah. So he showed that special distinction of going out to greet him holding a candle. So Rav Azriel Hilzheimer was a very great person. And he didn't just on the whim, decide he's going to change the text. It was because he felt there was compelling evidence to do so. And the truth, we find, so Rav Azriel Hilzheimer was someone that could be trusted. The only thing is, looking back from the perspective today, it seems that no manuscripts of Rashi have been discovered, of the commentary of Rashi. Of course, there's no manuscripts of Rashi's own handwriting, but there is no manuscripts that have the words written the way it was written, the way it was suggested, by the Berliner Rashi. In other words, Varel El Ha'avos, I appeared to the patriarchs. Nowhere is it mentioned that it was Va'erel El Avram Yitzchak Yaakov in the words of Rashi. The manuscripts just say Va'era El Ha'avos. It doesn't say Avram Yitzchak Yaakov. Okay, so, but and then
it's 11:15.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. I'll just finish up quickly this point, and I just want to say that so in the Vilna Gaon, perhaps more than anybody else, changed texts. But the Vilna Gaon, besides the fact that the Vilna Gaon was just as great as one can imagine, and he had a mind like a computer, and the Vilna Gaon had traveled because he had planned to move to Eretz Yisrael, and it's known that while he was going through the city, he stopped somewhere in Turkey, I think, but he visited all the libraries on the way to look at the manuscripts. So it is suggested that many of his suggestions were corroborated by manuscripts, and perhaps manuscripts that he himself saw when he passed through the various cities that had libraries. So, changing the text could be, it sometimes has its place, but it has to be only someone who really understands what compelling evidence is. Otherwise, it could be misused, chas v'sholom. Okay, now I just want to start over here. So the Torah says, God spoke to Moshe and said, I am God, Yud Kei Vav Kei. Va'era, I appeared, El. So Rashi says, El Ha'avos. And then the Torah continues, Avram Yitzchak Yaakov. So the question is, and I raised that question, what does it mean? Is Rashi coming to tell us that Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov are the Avos, are the patriarchs? It couldn't be that. So I want to try to understand that. And then it's very strange also. What is this pasuk dealing with? Because at the end of last week's Sedra, Moshe Rabbeinu complains to God, and he says, "Umeyaz basi al paro l'daber b'shimcha." From the time I came to Paro to speak in your name, to demand the exodus of the Jewish people, to ease their burden. Their situation did not improve. On the contrary, their situation became much worse. And you did not save your nation. Moshe Rabbeinu is complaining to God. And then God answers him in the last pasuk of last week's Sedra. Vayomer Hashem al Moshe ato tireh. You will see, Asher esel Pharaoh, what I will do to Pharaoh. Because with a strong hand, they will be sent out. With a strong hand, he will chase him out, from his land. And then that's the end of the Parsha, and that's the end of the Sedra. And then this week's Sedra begins. God speaks to Moshe and says, I am God. And he says, and I appeared to Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and with the name Kel Shakai. And Rashi explains, what does the name Kel Shakai mean? The name Kel Shakai means that I made promises to them, that they knew they wouldn't see the fulfillment of those promises in their lifetime. And they didn't complain. Ushmi Hashem, but my name, the name Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, the ultimate name of God. Lo nadati lahem. I didn't make known to them. The name Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, Rashi says, means I'm giving a commitment to you, but you will see the fulfillment of the commitment. The others got commitments, they got promises, they got covenants, but they knew that they wouldn't see the fulfillment of those commitment covenants and the promises. And they did not complain. And to you I appeared, and I told you that you will see the fulfillment, and you complain. So in other words, God is retorting in this week's Sedra to Moshe Rabbeinu's answer. So apparently God had, in a sense, two revelations to Moshe in retorting to Moshe's complaint. You didn't save the people. The first answer is, you will see. And the second answer, the second time he appeared to him, he said, listen, to the Avos, they didn't complain, and you are complaining. Why is it that these two statements, both of which are directed as a retort to Moshe Rabbeinu's question or complaint, are said as two separate revelations? And then the second question is, this is not a question against the Torah. This is a question against Ezra HaSofer. Ezra HaSofer was the one who formulated the Sedros. In other words, why did Ezra HaSofer divide the Sedros at this point, where Moshe Rabbeinu is in a sense in the middle, where God has a second point to make in retorting to Moshe Rabbeinu's comment at the end of last week's Sedra. And logic would dictate that either have Moshe Rabbeinu's complaint at the beginning of this week's Sedra and have the first answer that God gave also at the beginning of this week's Sedra, followed by the second answer, Or the beginning of this week's Sedra should be part of last week's Sedra. We have to understand that. Now, it's very interesting. And this is a question that Rashi raised. The answer I'm going to give is based really on Rashi, but I'm going to formulate it a little different. God says to Moshe, "Va'erel Avram el Yitzchak el Yaakov bekel Shakai." I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob with the name Kel Shakai, Ushmi Hashem, but my ultimate name, the name Yud Kei Vav Kei, Lo Nadati Lahem. I didn't tell them. And the question, I didn't make known to them. And the question is, what do you mean you didn't make known to them? Throughout Chumash Bereshis, God made the name, mentioned the name Yud Kei Vav Kei. So what do you mean, Lo Nodati Lahem? I didn't make known to them. So Rashi explains, Lo Nodati Lahem, that it wasn't fulfilled in their lifetime. Now, just want to explain that. The Rambam at the beginning of Yad HaChazaka, he says, Yisod HaYisodos, the foundation of all foundations, Va'amud HaChochmos, and the pillar of all knowledge, Leida, to know. Sheyesham Motzu Rishon, there is he who existed first before anything else. V'hu Mamtzi Kol Nimtza, and he brings into being everything that exists. V'chol Hanimtzaim B'Shamayim Uvaretz, and everything that is found in heaven and earth, Ubeinehem, and between them, Eino Elo Me'amitas Himtzo, comes out of the truthfulness of his existence. This is the mitzvah of belief in God. And many are troubled by the question, why does the Rambam says that the mitzvah is leida, to know of God's existence, to know that God is the creator, to know that God is the one who gives everything the ability to continue to exist, to know that God is the sustainer of the world. Why does the Rambam use the word leida, to know? The better word would be lahamin, to believe. As a matter of fact, in the Hebrew translation of the Sefer Mitzvos, the word lahamin is used. Reb Chaim Heller pointed out that in the original manuscript, the Rambam wrote the Sefer Mitzvos in Arabic. He used an Arabic word that means both to believe and to know. So it could be that the Rambam really meant it to be to know of God's existence, but they translated it to believe. But whatever the case is, everybody is troubled. Why did the Rambam, certainly in Yad HaChazaka, says, he doesn't say to believe in God's existence, but to know of God's existence. And everybody assumes, and there's a whole discussion about it, that belief, the difference between belief is, my parents told me, I believe it. To know, some assume the Rambam was a philosopher, and the Rambam felt it's not enough to believe, but when someone reaches a certain intellectual level, he has to intellectually understand, to know of God's existence. Aristotle had a bunch of proofs, which the Rambam mentions in the Yad HaChazaka for the existence of God. And then they deal with the problem of who's on that level, et cetera, et cetera. My uncle had a lot of trouble with that. In the Al Tshuva, my uncle mentions that the word Leda doesn't just mean to intellectually know, although that's certainly included, but he says the word Leda could be understood to experience. And he mentions the Pasuk, B'chol drachecha da'ehu. In all your paths, wherever you go, know God. And he said, when I see the sun rise, I shouldn't just see the sun rise. I should see God raising the sun. When it rains, I should see God giving rain. You have to experience God. And I think that there are a number of proofs for that. But one is HaKadosh Baruch Hu told Avram, Ati yadati ki yirei Elokim ata, after the Akedah, I know that now you fear God. Till that point, HaKadosh Baruch Hu didn't know that Avram. But the idea of yadati means experience. What's the idea of experience? Experience means it's part of the present. It's part of the present. So, and then we, in regard to the sukkah, we say, why do you have to sit in sukkah? Leman yedu doroseichem ki basukos hashafti es bnei Yisrael mitzrayim. In order that your generations yedu, which commonly translated means should know, that I took the Jewish people in a sukkah, in Sukkos, out of the land of Egypt. They traversed the desert, leaving Egypt, dwelling in Sukkos, in booths, whether it was booths of Ananei Kavod or regular booths, whatever it was. In other words, it's not enough to give a speech. It's not enough to tell over your children. You have to, in a sense, experience it. So much, such a large part of the Torah is the idea, especially the holidays, is re-experiencing. It's not enough to say, but it's in a sense, it has to be a re-experience. Sukkot also is a re-experiencing. It has to be experienced. And what is the expression? L'man yedu doraseichem. You have to experience. So we could say here that lo nodati lahem, I did not cause them to experience. They didn't experience the fulfillment of these commitments. To the avos lo nodati lahem, I didn't experience. Now, I want to explain that a little bit more. Now, Rashi says, and pointed out, that to the avos, God appeared with the name Kel Shakai. The name Kel Shakai denotes commitment, promise. But they knew they wouldn't see the fulfillment of the promise. Ushmi Hashem, but my name Yud Kei Vav Kei. I didn't make it known to them. In other words, they knew that they're not going to experience. But to you, I make known the name Yud Kei Vav Kei. I'm giving you commitments that you will see the fulfillment of those commitments. Now we need to understand. It's very strange. How does the name Yud Kei Vav Kei denote commitments that you will fulfill the commitments, and Kel Shakai is commitments that you won't necessarily see the fulfillment of those commitments. Years ago, when I was a student, so Rabbi Wernick was the mashgiach at the Hebrew Theological College. So on Sunday mornings, he used to ask me to come over. This was in 1967. Every Sunday morning, he would ask me to say over a thought that I thought of over Shabbos. So this, I had mentioned this explanation that I'm going to suggest now, and he liked this thought very much. Anyway, but the name Kel Shakai, where do we find the name Kel Shakai used in the Torah, in Chamisha Chumshei Torah? In all the cases but one, it's dealing with a bracha of Pirya Verivya, of having many descendants. It's mentioned to the Yavos, to Avram, to Yaakov. It's mentioned, the Yaakov mentions it to Yosef. The name Kel Shakai is always in the Torah, except in Parshas Balak. It's associated with the mitzvah Pirya Verivya, with not the mitzvah, the bracha, the blessing of having many descendants. But it's interesting that it's not mentioned in the two places where Pirya Verivya is originally mentioned. It's not mentioned in Bereshis, and it's not mentioned in Parshas Noach. Apparently, there's a difference between the bracha, the blessing of Pirya Verivya that's mentioned in Bereshis, which also includes the mitzvah, and in Noach, as opposed to the brachos of having many descendants that were given to the patriarchs and to Yosef and to Menashe and Ephraim. So how are we to understand that? Now the name Kel Shakai. What does the name Kel Shakai mean? The name Kel Shakai, according to some, it means Misha Omer L'Olam Dai. He who told creation enough. In other words, it represents to a certain degree the ceasing of creation. But when creation ceases, so nature begins. And also some said Mishadet Marche Hateva, and Mishadet could be a double meaning, opposite meanings, but the more prevalent meaning, Mishadet, he breaks Teva. So he breaks nature. What's the idea of breaking nature? I think the Rambam points it out that there's a breaking of nature within nature. The way I would explain it, I don't know that the Ramban meant that, but the way I would explain it, the world was not made to be exactly the same. Part of nature is change. And having children, having future generations, that's not only adds to the world, but changes the world. If there was no change in the world, there wouldn't be future generations. Everything would be exactly the same. It's not dramatic changes. It's not dramatic changes because it's common, but it contributes. Kel Shakai means it's associated with the future. However, but it's breaking of nature within nature. And I think there is a and the name Yud Kei Vav Kei, according to the Mekabalim, according to the mystical tradition, that is Haya Hove V'yiyeh. God was, God is, and God will be. But what's the difference between Yud Kei Vav Kei and the words Haya Hove V'yiyeh? God was, God is, and God will be. The difference is that Haya Hove V'yiyeh is 3 different words. And the name Yud Kei Vav Kei is 1 word. The name Yud Kei Vav Kei is 1 word. In other words, in the name Yud Kei Vav Kei, so past, present, and future are all 1. There is no separation. There is no separation between past, present, and future. By man, there is a separation between past, present, and future. There is a wedge that separates past from present and present from future. But by God, there is no separation between past, present, and future. And in a sense, we could say that in the name Yud Kei Vav Kei, where there is no separation between past, present, and future, there is no separation between the past of the commitment, the present of the commitment, and the future of the fulfillment. It's all 1. Whereas the name Kel Shakai talks about the future. The difference, why is Kel Shakai mentioned? Why is Kel Shakai mentioned only by period Verivia of the patriarchs and the Jewish people? Because I think it's to separate between the perspective of period Verivia, of having the Torah perspective for the period of Rivian, Bereshis, and Noach. That's for the whole world. In a sense, that's conquest of land, settling the land being the earth. But it doesn't have to do with heritage. Heritage is making ties, linking the past, present, and future. The future is separate from the present, and the present is separate from the past. But we still have to link past, present, and future. And in Jewish tradition, having children is not just populating the world or having many descendants. It's part of the act of linking past, present, and future. So the name Kel Shakai is associated, it talks about the future, but it talks about a linkage with the future. And so this is, and we take a look. What's very interesting is, so by the Avos, they were given commitments. They were given commitments about the future, but the future was linked to the present, and the past. Whereas the Moshe Rabbeinu, past, present, and future, was all one. Now, I mentioned in the past, I think talking about linkage, I mentioned about Eliezer was sent by Avram to get a wife for Yitzchak. And he goes to Haran, he goes to Orkastim, he goes to Avram's place of origin, so to say, and he brings Rivka back as the wife for Yitzchak. And the Medrash tells us, he said, Ulai lo yava isha laleches, what'll happen? In other words, Eliezer really did not want to fulfill that mission, but once he was told, he accepted it. But he would have preferred for Yitzchak to marry his own daughter. And the question is, what was wrong? Eliezer's daughter was brought up in the house of Avram. Why was she not considered worthy to be a wife for Yitzchak, whereas Rivka was considered to be a wife for Yitzchak? And we know that Rivka was brought up in the house of Lavan and Psuel. And we know for sure that Lavan was Oved Avodah Zarah. He was a person who worshipped idols. So why was Eliezer's daughter considered inferior? Medrash says that Avram said, my son is Baruch, my son is blessed, Yitzchak is blessed, and you're a descendant of Canaan, you're cursed. So there can't be a union. The question is why? What's the explanation behind it? And I mentioned at the time that when Avram went to the Akedah, so it was on the third day, and the Medrash says, Vayaris Hamaka, as he's traveling to Har Moriah, to Eretz HaMoriah, to the land of Moriah, where he builds the Mizbeach, he builds the altar, that ultimately he's going to place Yitzchak on top of it in fulfillment of God's command. Vayaris Hamaka Meirachok, from afar, he saw the place. And the Medrash says, Marah, what did he see? He saw Har Noah, he saw a beautiful mountain. For Anon Kosher Eleha, and a heavenly cloud was tied to it. And he turned to Yitzchak, the Medrash says, and he said to Yitzchak, what do you see? And Yitzchak said, Har Noah ani roeh, I see a nice mountain, Ba'anan kosher aleha, and a cloud, obviously a heavenly cloud, kosher attached to it. And we could say the Medrash deduces it from the fact Vayaris HaMakom. Makom is identified with God. Makom is considered one of the names of God. So from afar, he didn't just see the mountain, he experienced God's presence on the mountain. And then he turned to the Shnei Narav, the two servants that he had with him. And he said to them, and the Medrash says, who were the two servants? Medrash says, one was Eliezer, who was a servant, was an Eved. And the other was Yishmael, who was the daughter, the son of Hagar. Hagar was a maidservant. And he said to them, what do you see? And they said, we don't see anything. So he said to them, Shvu lachem poem achamor. Stay here with the donkey. The donkey doesn't see anything special. You don't see anything special. Ani v'hanar nelchat kol v'noshuv aleichem. Me and the lad, me and Yitzchak, me and Isaac, we will go to Mount Moriah, and we'll bend down there before God, and we will turn to you. And the question is, first of all, okay, Yishmael, you could say what you want, though Yishmael did tshuva, but Eliezer was such a great person. Why is it that Eliezer did not see the heavenly cloud? And it's interesting, the Das Kenim Ibal Tosfos says, when he said, stay here with the chamor, he says, just like a chamor doesn't have yichus, doesn't have pedigree, you also don't have pedigree. Okay, the Gemara seems to make it a little different drasha, but whatever. This is what the Das Kenim Ibal Tosfos says. And the question is, what's the relationship between not seeing the cloud, the idea there was no legal pedigree, and how are we to understand all of that? But the answer is, a slave has no concept of a past, and he really doesn't have a concept of a future. Why doesn't the slave have pedigree? Because pedigree connects the past with the present and the present with the future. And Vayar Samacham, so a slave, Eliezer was a great man. But what happened to all the descendants of Eliezer? Where are they? Eliezer had a great present, but he did not have a sense. He wasn't able to connect with the future. Because he wasn't able to connect with the future, his daughter, even though she must have been a very fine person, but it was only a present. What happened to the Hanefesh Sherasu B'Charan? All the souls that Avram made in Charan. And Rashi mentions that there are two explanations. One is those were his servants, and the other is those were the people who he had a religious impact on, the Gerim, as they were called. And the truth is, in all probability, both were true. They were servants of Avram, and they were Gerim. They accepted Avram's faith. And Avram had a great impact on their lives. But after all said and done, they were Avadim. They were his servants. They only had a concept of a present. They had no future. So because of that, so Shechina, see, Eliezer could see Shechina when Shechina was right in front of him, when the heavenly cloud was standing before him. But when it's Meirachol, when it's from far away, he couldn't see it. And as a matter of fact, the Medrash tells us that Ra'asa Shifcha, I mentioned this also, Ra'asa Shifcha Yam, the maidservant at the sea, saw more revelation than Yecheskel ben Buzi. But Yecheskel ben Buzi, we know what happened to him. The question is, what happened to the maidservant at the sea? And the answer is, she saw more at that fleeting moment of the present. But that inspiration she wasn't able to take. Why? Because she was a maidservant. She did not at that point yet have the ability to take the impact of the present and bring it into the future. To be an Av or a name of the Jewish people. To be a mother and a father, a patriarch and a matriarch of the Jewish people. You have to be able to focus on the future. You know, today, parents, they want to have, You have instant coffee, instant tea, everything. There's such a thing as instant nachas. They want instant nachas. They want to see how many awards their children get at graduation. But the true parent is not how many awards they're going to get at graduation, but how am I preparing him for future life? You have students in yeshiva that in the yeshiva, they're just outstanding. But once they leave the yeshiva, after a short while, you don't hear of them anymore. And I'm not talking from a scholarship perspective. In other words, the question is, are we preparing our students for life, or are we preparing them for graduation? At one time, they would say that what was the problem of the Talmud Torah system? The problem of the Talmud Torah system, and this is not to talk against the Talmud Torah system. On the contrary, we should make Talmud Torahs stronger. We have to reach out to people. But the problem with the Talmud Torah system was the goal. I'm not talking what they wrote in their brochures, but in practice was to get the child to be bar mitzvah, bas mitzvah. The goal of Jewish education has to be able to lead a Jewish life. So to be a parent of the Jewish people, you have to have a sense for the future. Eliezer's daughter was probably a very, very fine person, but because she didn't have the sense for the future, she couldn't be Yitzchak's wife, because Yitzchak's wife had to be the matriarch of the Jewish people. Rivka had that sense for the future. And we could perhaps suggest that that's what Rashi's trying to tell us here. The Rashi's trying to tell us, these psukim are telling us what was unique about Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. What was unique about them? What was unique about them is that even though they knew that they wouldn't see the fulfillment of the haftachos, the fulfillment of the commitments, nevertheless, they were satisfied. Why? They were satisfied because they were concerned about the future. So that's why Rashi says, Va'era el ha'avos, I appeared to the avos, because this pasuk tells us why they were avos, why they were the patriarchs, what was their unique trait. They didn't focus so much on the present as they focused on the future. So they had the trait that was essential to being an Av, to being the patriarchs of the Jewish people. And in a sense, we could say, that's why God did not answer Moshe Rabbeinu's complaint at one time. First, he said, Atatira, you'll see. And then, in a sense, it's the end of the Parsha. And then God completed his answer. He said, Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, I talked to, and I told them commitments, and they knew they wouldn't see the fulfillment of those commitments. But to you, Moshe, you'll see the fulfillment of the commitments. And then it goes further to discuss about how the Gula eventually will take place. And the reason why is it in two separate Parshas? Because Moshe had to learn one lesson. Moshe had to learn the lesson of patience. You have to wait, Moshe. If the Jewish people are let out right away, they might have an immediate freedom. But there will be many problems, many additional problems that they wouldn't have otherwise. They have to know who Paro really was. God had to give Paro the opportunity to show who he really was. Because what happens very often when we deal with somebody who enslaves or is anti-Semitic, after a while, Jews began to think, he really had our best interest in mind. You take a look, it's more next week's Sedra. You take a look at the Camp David Accords. The president of Egypt came to an agreement with Menachem Begin. Carter made that peace treaty. And who does that the world give credit to? And many Jews, not to Menachem Begin, to making peace. They give it to the president of Egypt. Certainly Carter, who was a known anti-Semite. He said the hardest leader to deal with was Menachem Begin. The easiest was the president of Egypt. So it was important for the Jewish people to see what Paro really wanted to do or didn't want to do. They had to know who Paro really is. And there are other things also. When the French Revolution took place, my father would always mention, and overnight, all the liberals became the biggest murderers, with official sanction, of course. It wasn't God what was redeeming the Jewish people, not just in the present, but he was redeeming them for the future. And it was necessary that it shouldn't be an instant freedom. It should be atatira, you'll see. And that's the reason why also Ezra Hasofa thought that it was proper to divide the Sedras here, to emphasize this point. Moshe, you have to have patience. We're looking forward to freedom. And in our own generation, last week I talked about how we have to believe Mashiach can come at any moment. But the fact that if Mashiach doesn't come in the next moment, we have to have patience. He can come the moment afterwards. And this is our lesson. Everything is done by Kadosh Baruch Hu to help Klal Yisrael, not just for the next moment, but for the future of Klal Yisrael. And this is the attitude of the Avos. The attitude of the Avos was, I'm concerned about the future more than I'm concerned about the present. The present is important in terms of the impact that it will have on the future. And we have to have that attitude also. When we evaluate the present, we should not evaluate the present in terms of the present itself, but in terms of also how it will affect the future, our future, and the future of future generations of Klal Yisrael as well. Okay.
Thank you. People can put questions in the chat. So one question is, why doesn't the Torah in Lech Lecha and Vayera tell us the words Kel Shakai?
It does. By Bris Milah.
Okay, by Bris Milah, but in other places, Vayera Hashem el Avram.
Because Bris Milah is where Avram becomes the completion of being a Jew.
Okay. Another question is the idea of the instant redemption versus the long-term redemption. Could that be the difference between Hatzalah and Geula, which were both of the Lashonos of Geula at the beginning of this week's Parsha?
So in the beginning of this week's Parsha, so according to the Shiltus, according to the Netziv, the way that Netziv explains the Shiltus, so the Gemara says that there's two Lashonos, the first two cups require Haseba, or the last two cups require Haseba. And the Lashon that says the first two cups require Haseba, why? Because it's Adayin because it's still Avodim Hayinu. So in other words, when you have a Hotseisi and the Hitzalti, you're focusing on the situation of there having been Avodim, slaves. Whereas the Ga'alti and the Lakachti, that's focusing on something more than that. So to a certain degree, that there is truth to that.
Okay. Someone asked if you mentioned about the breaking of nature. Is that related to evolution, like Darwin?
Whatever changes take place in nature, that is part of the changing of nature. I'll phrase it that way. You see that whether it's true or not is a separate question, but you see, according to the Chazon Ish and according to the Chassam Sofer, we say that the shiurim of the size of an egg changed. So apparently there are changes. Or of a olive, the size of the olives changed. Whether they did or didn't is machlokas. But according to their shita, apparently there are physical changes. The only thing is, it seems to me that the kel shakai is used primarily in regard to man, but in terms of the changes of nature, that would be true.
Okay. Last week you discussed Yaakov's reasons for wanting to communicate the Geula to the Shvatim and wanting to share when the Geula would occur. Why not focus on teaching them to perceive the past, present, and future together?
Well, to perceive them together is beyond human comprehension. That's something that's a godly thing. If you mean linkage, he certainly was trying to link it. He was telling them the future, what will happen to you, Ba'achris Hayamim, well, what will happen in the future.
Okay, I don't see any other questions. So thank you very much. Next week at the 12 o'clock again.
11
Meet at
o'clock.
11 o'clock.
Yeah, you were talking to the people in New York, apparently. Anyway, so
I love
okay.
looking at the clock now.
Okay, I understood. Okay, that's fine. That's fine. Yeah, 11 o'clock is fine.
Okay.
Okay,
Thank
everything should go well. Okay,
Have a good week.
you too.